Hello, and thank you for joining me for this little video. I'm very glad that you decided to humor me while I get ready for my day and talk about something that I think is very important. Enjoy!
I didn't think I was going to have to do this. I've been pretty quiet for the past year or so when it came to most things political. Well, because there really wasn't anything that I felt I needed to yell about. So, here we are again. Welcome. New place this time. And I figured that today we would talk a little bit about voting rights, particularly voting rights for women in this country. So let me give you some context first. So I've already done all of my prep and lotion and product on my face that I usually do before this. So don't worry, I'm not putting this makeup here on a face that doesn't have moisturizer. Okay, context. The reason why I'm doing this is there is a bill that was introduced to, I believe, the House of Congress. Yes, by Representative Roy Chip. Maybe it's Chip Roy of Texas. Of course it's Texas. It is HR, yes, it's a House resolution. So it was introduced to the House. House Resolution 22. It is a variation of the SAVE Act. It's an amendment to the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, and it has been entered into Congress a couple of times over the years in different variations. The reason why it's a lot more concerning this year, I'm going to get into, and that's why this is about women's suffrage. So, one thing that I find a little bit concerning is that when you look, there's not a bill summary. And so a bill summary is basically, a quick little synopsis of what the bill's all about, so that people can quickly read it, because people don't want to read a huge piece of legislation with a bunch of legalese that they don't understand. Well, this particular bill, although it's been introduced, does not have a bill summary. That is both very strange and very concerning. One, why would a bill not have a bill summary? When a bill summary is specifically meant to make the lay person, the voter, the normal, average individual be able to understand something that's complicated, that's the only reason why I can think that they would release this bill and introduce it without a bill summary, is so that the average person just wouldn't read it. They just wouldn't do it because there's no summary. Good thing I read bills all day long for my job, and so I was like, okay, I'm just going to go ahead and read this. And also, luckily, since I have many other things to read for work and grad school and otherwise, it's a fairly short bill. So to get back to context, let's talk a little bit of history. In the 1700s in the United States, only white landowners could vote. Okay, white Christian males. People in this country that had suffrage were people who owned property. Okay, hopefully that's common knowledge. It wasn't until the 1920 that the suffrage amendment was passed, and so the first election women could vote in was in 1920. And most of those women were married, because, as I'm going to get into later, women could not have their own money. They belonged to their father until they were married, and then they belonged to their husband. Not necessarily like ownership, but essentially that ownership of that woman's financial situation and taking care of that woman transferred to her husband. Okay, so that all being said, big voter regulation shift in 1920 when some women were allowed to vote. Fast forward to 1965, the Voting Rights Act, which allowed more people to vote. Okay, black women, women of color, people that didn't own things, people that didn't, not people of means, but there was still a lot of exclusions that states were allowed to impose. 1966, poll taxes were ended. Therefore, people that did not have means, people without money, then they could vote at that point. Fast forward again, 1971. Okay, the voting age was dropped from 21 to 18. So at that point, more people were allowed to vote. Young people, presumably young people of all races, of all sexes, genders, etc. Okay, fast forward again, 1974. Why is that date important? Well, at that point, women were finally allowed to have their own bank accounts and their own credit cards and had control of their own financial futures. Okay, 1974. Most of our parents, well, depending on who you are, your parents or grandparents, in my case, my parents, were both alive before 1974. When my mother was born, she and her mother couldn't have their own bank accounts. Now, this bill, House Resolution 22, that was introduced by Mr. Roy and a collection of other real great individuals that I'm planning on naming in the comments when I post a copy of this and all of my sources there. Okay? These people have introduced this bill guised as making it so only citizens can vote in this country. I'll tell you statistically, dead people don't vote. Non-citizens do not vote. I don't care what your echo chamber or your goblin that reigns from up high again has said. They don't. Okay? It's not a thing. But if you think it is, and you'd be willing to disenfranchise your mother, your sister, your daughter, your wife, if you don't want them to vote too, let me tell you. The bill is called Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, the SAVE Act, because they're saving the vote for white men. Okay. Let me digress. At the 2020 RNC, a nice lady named Abby Johnson spoke. A few months earlier, she had been asked what her most controversial stance is in a tweet. And she answered that she believed that head of household voting should be reinstated. So what's that? That's prior to the Voting Rights Act. Women couldn't vote. The household would vote. In other words, women have a vote. It's through their husband. A household should vote for things in this country, not individual people. Okay? I also want to preface this by saying it does not, this particular change, if it were to be enacted, does not affect me or my family. My wife and I have our maiden names. We have never changed our names. We have passports and identification that state what those names are, as do our children. Okay? Does not affect us. It does affect millions of other people in this country, and let me tell you why. This act states that in order to vote in this country, you have to have a passport with a name that matches your birth certificate. Your birth certificate and your ID must have the same name on them. Now, if you have a passport and it has your current legal name on it, that's great. However, the federal government has stated that if it has any gender marked other than male or female, that per what you've been assigned at birth, then it's no longer valid. So there's some issues with this, as well as various agencies in the State Department, as well as in the bureaus that issue passports have been gutted, and so now getting said passport is going to be very, very difficult, or a copy of your birth certificate. So say all you have is your driver's license, okay? Which the majority of young people do not have, college students and the like do not have access to their birth certificates because their parents still have their birth certificates at their house, or they might not even know where they are. I can't even count on, like, all fingers and toes, right, how many young people I know that have no idea where their birth certificate is. So if all you have is your ID, you could no longer vote, okay? So that impacts young people, that impacts people of color, that impacts people who have recently undergone natural disasters, because what if they're not able to get their hands on their on their birth certificate because they lost it in a fire in Los Angeles? Say somebody changed their name, not because they belong to a group of individuals who changed their name for any other reason other than they wanted to, right? Or let's say maybe they got married and they changed their name. So let's back up. If you are a woman in this country, and now in 2025 you have decided to take your husband's name for whatever reason, or say you're a man who decided to take your wife's name, but that name doesn't match your birth certificate and you don't have a passport and all you have is your ID, you no longer can vote. You're a young person who don't know where your birth certificate is and all you have is your ID. You no longer can vote. This sort of, I would say nonsense, but it's not really nonsense when it's this terrifying. This sort of anti-American, anti-democratic process legislation that exists right now and is being sold to the American people under the guise of protecting citizens' right to vote in this country is absolutely trying to rewind every little bit of scraping by in the 20th century that people did in order to be enfranchised, to have their voice heard through a democratic process in this country. And I don't want to hear anybody say, well, it's not a democracy, it's a constitutional republic. Yeah, it's a constitutional republic where people vote for their representatives. And you're trying to take away people's right to vote for those representatives so that some people's voices are louder than others. I wanted to highlight this. I wanted to bring it to your attention. I would love you to read it. It's short, I promise. Even though there is not a bill summary, you can make it through the legislation pretty quickly. So I just wanted to bring this to everyone's attention because it's dangerous, it's disenfranchising. Who it affects are your wives, your daughters, your sisters, your friends. It affects people, young people. It affects poor people who don't have access to a lot of their documents. It affects people that are houseless. It affects people that were negatively impacted by natural disasters. They are trying to roll back women's suffrage, young people's suffrage, people without means, poor people's suffrage. They are trying to go back as far as they can when white, Christian, male landowners could vote. Think about your future. Thank you. I'm Holly, and thanks for humoring me.